what he was about to do. In his hand, a note would eventually be left for the authorities, a carefully composed explanation that revealed his reasoning, his belief that he was sparing his family from future suffering, that he was carrying out an act of necessity in his own mind. The note would later be found, chilling in its rationality, its quiet detachment, its clear sense of purpose. Step by step, the plan unfolded. It was silent, disciplined, unhurried. There was no chaos, no argument, no struggle. The house remained, in every outward sense, the same home it had always been. Beds were made, dishes in place, music still resting in the air. And then, in the span of a few hours, the impossible became reality. The family John List had devoted himself to, the family he had meticulously raised, was gone. Then he left the house, the door closed behind him as if nothing had happened. Outside, the neighborhood remained still, unaware, oblivious to the horror that had occurred just inside. And yet, the silence, the emptiness, the normalcy of the night carried a weight, an invisible tension that hung in the air long after John disappeared into the night. But what he wrote in that note, what he left for the authorities to find, would shock the nation. It would reveal the depth of his planning, the precision of his mind, and the cold rationale that had guided every step. It would raise questions that would linger for decades. How could a man so devoted, so ordinary, execute a plan so unfathomable? How could the home of a loving family be transformed into a scene of incomprehensible loss without warning? And outside, the world went on. The neighbors slept, unaware. Streetlights glowed softly in the quiet night. Mailboxes swayed in the wind. The house appeared untouched, ordinary, serene. But inside, John List had made choices that would forever haunt the memory of that home. Choices that would leave questions lingering, unanswered for years to come. And for those who would later enter that home, who would read that note, who would trace the careful patterns of John List's life and mind, they would see not chaos, but an unnerving, deliberate orchestration. A man had acted with purpose, and the consequences were absolute. The morning after November 9th, neighbors noticed something unusual. The List house, usually alive with activity, was quiet, too quiet. Mail piled in the mailbox untouched, lights remained off. The hum of normal family life was absent. For the first time, the ordinary rhythm that had defined the home was broken. Police were called, initially by a neighbor who found the silence unsettling. And when officers arrived, the scene was almost absurd in its calm. The house was locked, tidy, unremarkable. Dishes were washed, beds made, the piano rested silently in the living room. Nothing appeared disturbed, nothing indicated violence, no broken furniture, no signs of a struggle. Yet the family was gone, the very people who had made the home feel alive, safe, and ordinary. Helen, Frederick, Patricia, Alma were nowhere to be found. The narrative pauses to reflect on the incongruity. The quiet house becomes almost a character itself, ordinary yet haunting. Every detail, the carefully folded laundry, the stacked books, the unopened mail, speaks not of chaos, but something deliberate, methodical, something carefully orchestrated. Then officers discovered the note. Its contents were simple, calm, and chilling in their clarity. In his own handwriting, John explained that he had taken his family from the world because he believed he was saving their souls. The note conveyed no anger, no remorse, only the quiet rationale of a man convinced that his actions were justified. Each sentence reflected months of planning, a mind that had thought through every angle, every consequence, every step. How could a man carry out such an act, leave such a note, and vanish without a trace? How could the world wake to a quiet, orderly home and a family gone without explanation? Questions piled up as quickly as the mail in the box, and yet no one had an answer. Investigators combed through the house for clues, and yet found little. No evidence of forced entry, no signs that anyone else had entered. Neighbors reported nothing unusual in the days or weeks leading up to the disappearance. Everything suggested that the family had simply vanished, leaving behind only the most ordinary traces of daily life. And in those traces, detectives felt the presence of a mind working quietly, deliberately, hidden in plain sight. The investigation became national news. FBI reports cataloged the missing family. Wanted posters were issued. Headlines appeared in local newspapers. Family disappears without a trace. Photographs of smiling faces framed in the newsprint contrasted sharply with the horror of their absence. Public fascination grew. The questions multiplied. Where did John List go? Where was the family? How could the ordinary facade of a home hide such an unimaginable act? As investigators pieced together the last known movements of the List family, the picture was both tantalizing and chilling. John had planned meticulously, leaving nothing to chance. No one saw him leave, no one saw the family leave. The journals, the ledgers, the careful attention to details all suggested a mind operating with precision, a plan executed with absolute control, and yet the world could not comprehend it. How could a man vanish with his family and remain hidden for 18 years? How could someone leave a note so calm, so rational, while the people he loved were gone? Every day, investigators chased fragments of information, phone calls, mail, tips from neighbors, sightings that never panned out. And yet John List was always one step ahead, moving in silence, leaving only questions in his wake. Images flash in the mind's eye, FBI reports stamped in red ink, wanted posters pinned to bulletin boards, grainy newspaper photographs of smiling children, a mother's gentle face, a grandmother's quiet eyes. Each image is a reminder that behind the ordinary home, behind the carefully folded laundry and piano music, something extraordinary, terrifying, and meticulously planned had occurred. And the questions lingered, unsolved, haunting for years to come. Where did John List go? Where was the family? How could a life so meticulously ordered become a mystery that would endure for nearly 2 decades? The story of the List family didn't end with their disappearance. In fact, the events that followed would stretch across nearly 2 decades, weaving a web of deception, patience, and meticulous planning. After committing the unthinkable, John List vanished. He moved quietly, deliberately, choosing a life far removed from the city where his crimes had occurred. With careful preparation, he assumed a new identity, Robert Clark, and settled in a small, unassuming town. In this new town, he appeared to the world as a devoted, ordinary man. He joined a church, attended social events, and became a familiar figure in the community. Within a few years, he married again. Neighbors would later describe him as polite, reserved, and deeply committed to his new family. To them, Robert Clark was a model citizen, a man devoted to faith and family, living a quiet life without controversy. But while he presented this image, authorities were still searching. The case of the List family had not been forgotten. Detectives, FBI agents, and law enforcement officers across several states had John List at the top of their most wanted lists. He was considered a highly intelligent and methodical fugitive, one who had planned his disappearance with extreme precision. Every tip was followed, every lead investigated, and every possible connection scrutinized. Do you think someone in the community suspected him? For 18 years, the trail went cold again and again. Friends of the List family were interviewed repeatedly. Neighbors who had once known John List shared memories that now seemed hauntingly ordinary. Yet despite years of searching, the man who had taken an entire family from the world remained free. Then, in 1989, a single photograph changed everything. It was published in a magazine feature aimed at locating fugitives, America's Most Wanted. Among hundreds of faces, one photograph stood out to a viewer in Virginia. The man in the picture, Robert Clark, looked familiar. There was something about his posture, the expression in his eyes, the way he held himself, that struck the viewer as oddly recognizable. This casual observation would trigger a chain of events law enforcement had been waiting for. The tip was called in. Investigators began to quietly observe Clark's daily life, comparing old photographs, analyzing handwriting samples, and reviewing records. Slowly, piece by piece, they began to realize the truth. Robert Clark was John List. The revelation stunned those following the case. A man who had committed such an atrocity, who had disappeared completely, had lived nearly 2 decades under the radar. Authorities discovered how carefully he erased his past. Old documents destroyed, social connections severed, every trace of his previous life meticulously hidden. His ability to construct a new identity allowed him to move freely, to marry again, to build a seemingly normal life. And yet, it was a single photograph, an unremarkable image in a magazine that would finally expose him. The moment of discovery was almost accidental. Years of planning, of evasion, of careful control over his own narrative were undone by something so small, a photograph taken at the wrong place, seen by the right person. And then, in 1989, a single photograph brought him down. For those who had followed the case, this moment raised a question impossible to ignore. How could a man live for so long, so quietly, and yet carry such a dark past with him every day? Did he believe he had done the right thing? Did he fear discovery in secret? Or did he feel nothing at all as he built a new life over the foundation of the lives he had destroyed? The answer would not be simple, but it set the stage for the next chapter. The final confrontation, the unraveling of a carefully constructed life, and the moment John List, or Robert Clark, would finally be forced to face the consequences of his actions. Every lead, every tip, every small observation had brought investigators to this point. And now, nearly 20 years after the murders, the hunt that had spanned the country was about to end. After nearly 2 decades on the run, John List faced the consequences of his actions in a courtroom that seemed suspended between disbelief and inevitability. The prosecution presented a timeline of meticulous planning, detailing every step that had allowed him to vanish, build a new identity, and deceive an entire community. Evidence was presented with methodical precision. Handwriting samples, old photographs, bank records, and the very note he had left explaining that he believed he was saving their souls. The trial itself became a study in contrasts. On one side, the careful, rational, almost clinical mind of John List. On the other, the raw, unfiltered grief of the world he had left behind. Neighbors, friends, and relatives recounted memories of the family, emphasizing the ordinary humanity of their lives. A father who coached baseball, a mother who organized community events, children whose laughter had once filled a quiet New Jersey neighborhood. The courtroom revealed the depth of the betrayal. Every carefully curated image John List had presented in his second life, the devoted husband, the model church member, was weighed against the reality of the murders. It became clear that for nearly 20 years he had lived in 2 worlds simultaneously, one of warmth, familiarity, and trust, and another of cold calculation, murder, and disappearance. Psychologists and criminologists examined him, seeking to understand how a man could compartmentalize such profound violence. They documented his methodical thinking, his meticulous preparation, and his ability to suppress empathy for nearly 2 decades. Every explanation revealed more about his detachment from the lives he destroyed, yet none could fully reconcile the ordinary human appearance he maintained with the severity of his crimes. For the public, the trial became a mirror, reflecting questions about morality, trust, and the facades people construct. The narrative extended beyond legal arguments and verdicts. It forced observers to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. How does one recognize danger when it is cloaked in everyday normalcy? How does a family disappear from the world while leaving behind no immediate warning signs? The verdict, when it came, offered legal closure but not emotional closure. John List was convicted on multiple counts of murder, and the sentence was life imprisonment without parole. Yet the case continued to resonate. Media coverage, documentaries, and books explored the layers of his life, the meticulous deception, and the lessons for society. Even years later, questions lingered. Could the murders have been prevented if someone had noticed subtle signs earlier? Were there moments when neighbors, colleagues, or friends might have intervened? The answers remained elusive, buried in the tension between ordinary life and extraordinary violence. The story of John List is remembered not only for the crimes committed, but for the extraordinary patience, calculation, and concealment that followed. It is a case that forces a reckoning with the duality of human behavior, the capacity for both care and cruelty, creation and destruction, seen and unseen. And as the records, photographs, and letters are revisited, one truth remains undeniable. The consequences of his actions continue to echo far beyond the courtroom, in memories, in grief, and in the fragile trust of every community. John List grew up in an environment that was, by all outward appearances, ordinary, yet the pressures he experienced as a young man left deep marks. Financial strain weighed heavily on the family. The List household struggled to maintain appearances, and John, in particular, felt the weight of responsibility. Religion was central to his worldview. It was not merely a guide, it became a lens through which he evaluated morality, worth, and the fate of his family. Church services, scripture, and personal interpretation began to shape his decisions. Some saw it as devotion, others would later see the rigidity of his beliefs as an obsession that warped his moral compass. Family dynamics were complicated. John's relationships with his children and his wife revealed subtle tensions, disagreements about priorities, moments of frustration that might have seemed trivial to outsiders, but cumulatively added to his sense of pressure. In the months leading up to the murders, his behavior grew unusual. He became withdrawn, secretive, and methodical in ways that would later seem alarming. He began preparing for tasks that neighbors would never understand, organizing his personal affairs with meticulous care, and leaving subtle signs of internal struggle that no one noticed at the time. What do you notice about his behavior? Are there small details that seem off? Every day, John presented a veneer of normalcy. Behind that exterior, however, he was quietly planning, calculating, and preparing. On the day the murders would take place, John moved with purpose. There was no chaos, no hesitation. Every step was planned. Items were collected, personal effects, letters, and other tools that would serve his plan. He left a note not to excuse his actions, but to rationalize them. In his words, he believed he was saving their souls. To the outside world, it read as chillingly calm and calculated. Neighbors, in hindsight, described the day as ordinary. The mailman delivered letters, the children left for school. The house seemed as it always had. But behind closed doors, a series of irrevocable choices were being carried out. Neighbors thought nothing was wrong. Even the smallest details, the way doors were locked, the absence of struggle, the precision of the actions, would later puzzle investigators. Every decision was deliberate, every movement calculated to leave minimal evidence. The tragedy, though committed in a private home, sent shockwaves far beyond. The scene left behind was eerily untouched, a reflection of both John's planning and the incomprehensible horror of his acts. When the family failed to appear, neighbors began to grow concerned. Police were called, and what they found would haunt the investigation: a tidy home, untouched belongings, and a note that raised more questions than it answered. The note was analyzed meticulously, offering insight into John List's thinking. Law enforcement pieced together the timeline, trying to reconcile the quiet order of the house with the violent reality that had occurred inside. Media coverage amplified the story. Newspapers and television outlets broadcast the disappearance, sparking fear and curiosity in communities far beyond the small town where the List family had lived. Public fascination grew, fueled by the contradictions: a neat, orderly home, a loving family, and the knowledge that something irreparably tragic had occurred. Pattern interrupts appeared as interviews with neighbors and journalists recounted ordinary moments: children playing in the yard, the parents hosting community events, and a quiet neighborhood unaware of the danger lurking within its own streets. These perspectives reminded viewers that the ordinary could mask the extraordinary. The FBI entered the investigation, taking over what would become one of the longest manhunts in American criminal history. Leads were followed, mistakes were made, and near misses stretched the tension across years. John List's new life under the identity of Robert Clark added layers of complexity. For nearly 18 years, he moved between states, married again, and presented himself as a model citizen. Friends, neighbors, and church members knew nothing of his past. He had vanished so completely that many assumed the case had grown cold. How could he live undetected for 18 years? Every clue, every tip, and every false lead became part of the puzzle. Law enforcement was persistent. Patterns in behavior, financial records, and sightings slowly narrowed the possibilities, yet he remained elusive, almost beyond reach, until a single photograph surfaced that would bring everything to a head. In 1989, the photograph in America's Most Wanted triggered recognition. A viewer noticed the man, Robert Clark, living quietly in Virginia. The tip led authorities to confirm his identity. John List was arrested. The calm demeanor he displayed in custody contrasted sharply with the lives he had destroyed. Court proceedings began, documenting every aspect of his crime. The trial revealed meticulous planning, deception, and the emotional devastation left in his wake. Psychologists and criminologists weighed in, dissecting his behavior and exposing the duality of his existence: the ordinary man on the outside and the murderer who had erased an entire family from the world. The public was stunned, horrified, and fascinated. The case forced reflection on human behavior, trust, and perception. John List's actions were a stark reminder of how easily ordinary appearances can mask extraordinary deception. Financial pressures, rigid morality, and family dynamics intersected in a way that culminated in tragedy. Warning signs, subtle and easily overlooked, were there, but few recognized them at the time. Even today, could this happen again? The lessons extended beyond the legal and psychological. They spoke to the communities, families, and individuals who watched, forcing them to reconsider what signs might go unnoticed in their own lives. He meticulously planned the perfect crime, and it almost worked. Images of the List family filled the screen, smiling, ordinary, and now forever frozen in time. The note he left appeared on screen, each word carrying the weight of unimaginable decisions. What would you have done if you knew your neighbor was capable of this? The hour concluded not with closure, but with lingering unease, a reflection on trust, deception, and the fragile line between the ordinary and the unimaginable.